Okay, since we're getting a little bit late start, maybe we will not talk as much. Maybe we will. Notice I put the we on there, so we all know who
Yeah,
that'll
I
be.
heard the we.
Well,
We know it's really the I.
Yeah, I really want it to be a we, but let's open in prayer. Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for another chance to kind of glean from your word things that we need to apply. Help us to see clearly the things that you are meaning for us to see and understand and put to work in our lives. And as we enter a season in our church where maybe we're looking towards these specific offices, I pray that you'll help us all see ourselves as individuals in every one of these qualifications and be of a mind that we need to build into those things ourselves more. We pray it all in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. A couple of just kind of upfront summary things. We stopped in the middle of last week's presentation. I left it all on the old slideshow. I don't know whether I can go in and edit stuff out without destroying the whole thing, so I didn't try. But we talked about the different kinds of qualifications, and I told you I was borrowing heavily from Ben Merkel. I stepped up to the doorstep and maybe over the edge in plagiarism here. And today there's an awful lot of, at least paraphrased, of what he had to say, because what I did was I opened up some of these qualifications. We'll move into the second general classification. The first one was situational, that had to do with what he's doing, what things that are required in his, his home life and his children, and how people view him and what he's already doing. In general terms, is like a citizen or a neighbor or a reputation, and more specifically in his familial setting. And that's about where we stopped. The second general classification has to do with moral qualifications. And it too has two splits on it. They're generally qualifications that are put in the positive, like he must be, and then there are negative ones. That doesn't mean it's like a pejorative negative. It's like the terms in which the things are talked about are put in the negative. And they actually, some of them kind of overlap, because if you look at these texts in Timothy and Titus, they seem to be very similar, but they also seem to be a little bit repetitive. And some of it we'll see when it comes to especially the moral classifications. Paul might have said one thing in a positive thing, like being sober-minded, and the word sober is used for someone who doesn't drink a lot of, or doesn't have an addictive kind of a behavior, something that compromises his inhibitions or things of that nature. And then in the second part of it, in the negative part of it, it's put in there as not a drunkard, which will unfold. But one of the things I want you to see is, in the positive direction, it's very easy to put stuff in the way of what, if we just stay away from the stuff that can make somebody drink too much to excess, we've figured out the whole thing. And that's not what Paul is saying. Wine, for instance, was a part of life in that part of the country, and it's a part of ours, and it's not an evil thing. The problem with it is when you drink too much and you lose the sobriety, you lose the ability to control yourself and your inhibitions, or you become addicted to it and a drunkard. So it's a fine line. We're not going to go all fundamentalist here and just say, oh, if you touch not, taste not, everything will be cool. That's not what Paul is saying. So, and then we also had some things that we kind of made a note of in our discussion last week, is that the qualifications, like we talked about, are roughly divided into these two broad classifications with the two sub-classifications. And we covered those last week. This week, we're going to be moving on into the moral classifications for church office that are both divided into the positive and the negative, as I've said. But one thing I want you to also notice that we didn't talk about, and I hoped we would get to, is we mentioned that there's a reciprocal aspect of these things. The qualifications for eldership are similar, or even in some senses identical to the qualifications for a deacon. And there's a reason for that, is where you're looking for the character of a man that is going to hold a church office that is at least one half of something that an apostle was doing. But the other thing I want you to notice is the differences between Paul's letter to Timothy and his letter to Titus. The things we talked about last week that are lacking in one and present in the other. When Paul wrote to Timothy, he was talking about the church at Ephesus, which was by that point in time probably 12 to 15 years old, and it was more mature. There was a deeper bench from which to select elders. The letter that he wrote to Titus when he left him on Crete is a whole different situation. The people there are liars, lazy gluttons. It's not a real great situation. And so one of the things the glaring things that's screaming at us is the qualifications for elder and deacon, whatever they are and how they apply to each of us individually, are not absolutes. If you don't live up to every one of these qualifications, you can't be an elder or a deacon. Well, why would that be? Who could do it? Christ could do it. The apostles couldn't do it. Peter he screwed up all the time. So what these are is necessarily, there's a little bit of what we used to call, when I was in school, grading on the curve. It's situational to the church. So you're not necessarily looking for a guy in the middle of your little church, in the middle of an inner city ghetto, who is probably been killed 27 times for being the guy that he is. You're looking for somebody who is minimally better than the herd, that's somebody that's worthy of at least starting out to follow, and then the guy better learn his lesson that, oh, hey, now I've got pressure on me to be a better version of myself that I saw. So a guy that is elevated to an office from the congregation ought to be trying to become better at every one of these qualifications. This is to get you on the merry-go-round, but it isn't the whole ride. And too many places think that that's the case. That these are just what you do to get tenure. That once you got the job, you can never lose it. And that's not really the case. And that's not what Paul's talking about. He's telling these churches, look amongst you, find the men who are doing the best job and are better examples of all of these things than the rest of y'all. Follow him, and as he tries, at least to the degree that he's improving himself and becoming better at these things, so should you. So that in time, a church at Crete could look like the church at Ephesus, and maybe more qualifications are added to the office. That's kind of what's going on here. So, let's jump into these classifications and qualifications. Starting with the positive things. And if we need to go into another week, I'm willing to do that. We're at the end of the course. We're at the end of May, we're done. So we'll get as far as we can get. And I don't care how much this goes. And by the way, by the end of this or by the end of the summer, I'm hoping to hear from you all, because you're the faithful, about where we would like to maybe go next, what other things we should perhaps be studying. But let's go start with the positive things. The things that, according to these epistles, and again, I'm leaning on the way that Ben Merkel collated them. They're not in an order. He picked them out, classified them, and I think he did an amazing job of it. Best book I've ever seen on this subject. And so they're kind of skipping around, but he's put them into these classifications. So the positive things that a church leader, an elder or a deacon, needs to be, first is above reproach. Now, what I've opened up a little bit on your handout that's not in the slideshow here is I've put in a little bit of more definition of some of my own and some of Mr. Merkel's and some of just generally what the text unfolds to be of what these terms might mean. The first one being above reproach, which is a general overarching qualification. And by that I mean, like, when you're looking at, for instance, the attributes of God, there's one attribute of God that's transcendent. That means it sort of is a part of every other one of God's attributes, and it's his holiness. He's just, he's good, all those things, he's loving, but he's holy in every one of those things. Well, being above reproach in the same kind of sense is a transcendent qualification for an elder or deacon. That he needs to be, in all of these other things, the above reproach is going to be something that is in the background that you can go back and say, he's sober-minded to the point of being above reproach. He's self-controlled to the point of being above reproach. That's always going to be a kind of thing that's going on there. But it has to do with not his being perfect, but having what we would call a godly character. Somebody that you would look at and say, that's an upright man. He's free from blemishes in his character. By that I mean some oozing, obvious sore of character that's just written all over him. You shouldn't be picking somebody who is, maybe he's the president of the Rotary Club, but his home is a mess. He's got a reputation of being a dishonest businessman or whatever it happens to be. It's something that is a relative kind of a thing because of the situation of the church, but he's somebody that should kind of already be an example of character that's worthy to follow as we start a journey together. Any questions about that or comments? And this is where I want to have more interaction.
Okay.
That's good. I mean, I don't know what else you could say about that.
Well, because it's that transcendent one, we can come back to that as we're talking about any of these other ones. And feel free to jump in and please interrupt me if I can fill the air, as you all know, without breaking a sweat. Sometimes with breaking a sweat. The second qualification is that he's sober-minded, and the reference there is given to you. You notice that in the above reproach, it was in both Timothy and Titus. Sober-minded is mentioned to Paul, mentioned by Paul to Timothy at Ephesus, but not specifically to Titus in Crete. And I think some of that may have to do with the constituency from which these two young men were having to draw representatives for office. That maybe finding somebody sober-minded was an easier thing to do in Ephesus with a little bit of life experience and maturity on them, and it's a hopeful thing in Crete. Yes, Bob.
I wonder how successful they were in getting, because we don't read about the success or not very successful.
No. There's not much written about this, which I think is kind of a blessing in a way, because it's left as a standard that maybe nobody ever completely lived up to, so there's not a lot of success stories to find, but it's still a qualification.
One way to find out really would be, how successful were the churches? How long did they survive? And at Ephesus, those 7 churches weren't around anymore. No.
Well, or they are in some fallen way, or they were absorbed into something. The thing I want to be careful we don't do, and I'm not saying that's what we're doing here, is that we don't make something that seems a little open-ended, like a list of qualifications, not being relevant because no one ever lived up to them. All churches have their problems, and maybe to the point of their own extinction eventually. Nevertheless, this is what is something we're required to look at. But it would be a very interesting study to see historically. I am not prepared to answer how they went, how it succeeded or failed.
But like you say, I think it's best that they didn't, because like you said, it sets the standard for us, really.
You're right. As I have added here, the Greek word that is translated in 1 Timothy 3:2 as sober-minded is sometimes other places in the New Testament translated as temperate. And sometimes it's used directly in a connection with sobriety, like with drunkenness. And so this is like one side of the coin. Later in the negatives, the obverse of which is not a drunkard. So he's sober-minded and not a drunkard. They kind of go together, okay? But I think that the sense of the term here is to be looking more at the general mental sobriety, like all the time. Not just somebody who never is not sober, but somebody who has a mindset, a trait, a tendency, who has a character that's marked as being someone who will be able to logically reason through something in a way that is something that is upright and righteous, and it's an above reproach kind of thing there too. Any questions or comments about being sober-minded?
I'm glad you put in there about the mental sobriety, because I think most of us go immediately to consumption of,
Yes.
or excess consumption.
Yes. And the point there is excess. I mean, you can't escape the fact that God gave wine. Try in that part of the world, in that part of history, before there was refrigeration, for instance, to squeeze a grape and keep it from becoming wine. It's not possible. The yeasts on the outside of the skin of a grape, when you crush it, start fermenting the sugars in the inside of the grape the second that it's crushed. If you don't have something to arrest that development, like filtering and refrigeration, it's going to be wine. It's either new wine or it's, getting older and older, but it's something that's going to become alcoholic as the yeasts process the sugars. It's just something that happens. Drink offerings were part of the Old Testament sacrifices. Jesus' first miracle was to do what? To turn water into wine. The fact that all of the prohibitions in Scripture about wine are not about staying away from it, from abstaining from it, but not drinking it to excess. So to just say, oh, well, if we just eliminate wine, there'll be no drunkenness and everybody will be sober-minded. In the sense of this, that's not true. You'll just find something else to compromise your sobriety. So, now this isn't an advertisement that everybody should go start drinking wine. If you're not into that kind of stuff, these days you have more of a choice. Back then you could either drink brackish water or something that was on its way to becoming alcoholic. That's just the fact of the matter. If you didn't live near a spring of fresh water, you were drinking something that was bad for you one way or another, and it's the stuff that was alcoholic. You had to be careful that you didn't drink it in excess. It's just the facts. Moving on. Being self-controlled. Again, this is in both Timothy and Titus. This is something that I believe goes right straight back to both of the two things we've talked about. It's similar to being sober-minded, but it's aimed more at a practical exercise of being sober-minded, prudent, and discreet. And it's to the point of comparative, that this person is better at being self-controlled. He's more above reproach than his fellows about doing that kind of thing. It's not that you will never see the guy being something that is less than what you think it should be, but judging by the standards of Scripture, which, by the way, nobody can live up to absolutely, what is he generally characterized as being or being like? The next one, respectable. And you'll notice on your handout I put the 1 Timothy 3:8 in blue, and being dignified, because that's in the verses that have more to do with the diaconate than the eldership, but they're basically the same word and the same kind of translation. And it just basically means is the guy's bringing something to work with him already. He's not a novice at anything. He knows how to do these things already, and it's something that we all expect that somebody that we elevate to the office of elder or deacon is somebody that's going to start a learning process more formally than they have before. They're going to feel a need to be better under shepherds than they were when they come into office. We expect that we're going to show them some discretionary honor. We're going to use the honorific titles. We're going to speak of them as though they're our leaders with some degree of respect. Elder, pastor, deacon should be things that we think of as being something of honor that they get because of their office, and some respectability that we give them because of the office that they've been elevated to. But just because they're now wearing a uniform with badges on it doesn't mean that they weren't always men that were respectable. Men that got there because they showed already a tendency to be that something worthy of respect. A life that's already to some degree been proved as being worth our emulating. Something that we see a balance of their virtue and their character against all of the temptations of the world, and they're already somebody that we respect. Okay? These things are all little bits and pieces. You're like building a big wall with little bricks, but they all mean something. So, any questions or comments about any of that?
Well, one thing I see when we make these lists, these lists can apply to like policemen.
Yes.
All firemen.
Exactly.
These attributes are very important for those type of people.
And there's a gentleman in the room here who can tell you that that's what they've been beating. They beat on them to prove that's there and to make better the whole time that they're there. But they start out with something. They don't get into an academy without a whole lot of pretty invasive testing and looking into their lives. And your past can keep you from having a nice future. So they start out being respectable people. And then they're trained to be better at it. And maybe that's a microcosm of what we're talking about here, an example in the world of what it is like to be elevated to these offices.
The politicians probably should follow this very closely, I think.
You think? And yet, they're probably the best example of how it's broken in the world.
Yeah.
Is they do exactly the polar opposite.
That's right.
They go to Washington to be corrupted. There's a reason we call it the swamp. Okay, moving along. Hospitable. This one is kind of hard, actually, for a lot of people to do. It's not an easy thing. It was never a very easy thing for me to do. Some people are a little bit more private than others, but this is a kind of a sense in which the home life that you have, you open to everybody that you're given to serve in that office. It's a sense in which you automatically have an open door policy for all of the people in the church. You get, it speaks to having them come in, which is the easy thing. You can make a schedule of, okay, in the next 6 months, I'm going to go alphabetically through the church and have everybody over for dinner at least one time. Hospitable's taken care of. No, that's not primarily what the idea of hospitable talks about. It's about a home and a life that are open to and accessible to the flock. It's not a distant shepherd living in a hut on a hill someplace with a fence to keep the sheep away. It's living a life that is open and a hospitable character, someone who is willing to interrupt what is going on in their life at any moment to help somebody who has a need. And I honestly have to say, I've seen that a lot going on in this church. Maybe recently I've been looking for it more than others, and since she's not here, I'll pick on her a little bit. Kathleen Brooks is amazing at this. Yeah. I've watched her not be able to participate in some of the life of the church kind of stuff because some lady needed some counsel and pigeonholed her and talked the whole time through some problems. And so she missed out on maybe some fellowship that she might have enjoyed because she's been doing that to others. Your wife is an example of that. Yeah. There's so much of that I know that we send our wives out to do sometimes more than we should be doing ourselves. But this is a tough one, and this is something that it always should have been true. You should not have ever been an ivory tower kind of person that gets elevated to the office because you got an amazing pedigree of academics. You've got terminal degrees out the pores, but you're a cruddy person to have to hang around with. That's not what we're talking about. It's an approachableness. It's an ability to kind of be willing to pour yourself into somebody's life and allow them to pour themselves into yours to the degree that they come into your own personal sanctus sanctorum, your holy of holies, which is your home. It's an opening of your home to bring people in, but it's coming into you, not just to a place. Okay?
This is kind of troubling though, because if you're married, you may be hospitable, but it might be hard for your wife.
Yes.
Or vice versa.
Yes.
So, I mean, for a woman, it's very hard to have people come in spontaneously when,
It's true.
you know, you haven't cleaned the bathroom or, you know, whatever stupid thing other people might think it is.
You're
So,
absolutely right.
How can you reconcile that?
Well, you can practice becoming better at it, and there's certainly
Meaning as a couple?
Yes. Yes. But as individuals, it's something that we should all be more of. I mean, this is exactly some of the things we're talking about in this church right now is every church wants to grow. And you can get people coming in the door, but what makes them stay? They feel welcomed. What do we have hospitable characters? Do we have hospitable mindsets about greeting people and making them feel welcome and come in? And is this our home? Is this something where we keep them up in the front building and then we want them to come back and fill the pews, but we don't invite them into our hearts and into our fellowship? The actual doing of it is something we all need to get better at. Me especially. I mean, I used to have, my home is right now, it's way out in the far, you know, the plains of this church. But it was, at one time it was closer to the middle of things. We always had things at my house. And it's hard because, you know, sometimes you're sitting there going, are these people ever going to leave? I got to work tomorrow. I got to wash, I washed that one. I swept the floor. I vacuumed this floor. And now I got, you know, that stuff happens and it's something you deal with. But what's your attitude when you're dealing with people even here? Is it when my mental bed is unmade? When my heart floors are a little unswept? When my soul sink is filled with dirty dishes and I'm dealing with my own trials? Am I willing to reach out of my own ghetto and be something that somebody else needs? That's hospitality. It's a hard thing. Hard thing to do, and it's a hard thing to be. Maybe that's why it's on a list. Moving on. Gentle, 1 Timothy. Not in the Titus. Maybe that's because they weren't a gentle folk. I don't know. I do believe that they would have had to grow into being this more. It's not that none of these things aren't required of the Christians and the elders in Crete, but they definitely are something that is a life characteristic that I think takes a little bit of time. This is one of those things that is a trait of maturity. A knowledge that needs to be done, some experience doing it that somehow translates into a maturity of expression over time. It's a word that's usually or also translated as kind, gracious, or forbearing. Therefore, the other side of it is that it's not overbearing, scornful, or vindictive. It's something that speaks to somebody not being the kind of person that would retaliate against a wrong. I can speak from experience, and so can some men in the room here, that when you are in one of those offices, there are going to be plenty of opportunities for you to get upset. There are going to be lots of attacks and attempts at character assassination, and not all of them are legitimate. Some of them might be. What's your attitude about it? What is your reaction to it? Is your first reaction to put up the shields and arm the photon torpedoes, or is it to just say, is a little bit of diplomacy required here? Do I need to eat a slice of humble pie? Is the problem really me? Is it a sense of how you approach things? Maybe you let the other guy throw the first punch, or the first 2 or 3. Maybe you're not overly defensive or anything, but it's a sense of which you're approachable, even when what's approaching you is not necessarily a kind word. How are you reacting to things? And it's a gentle spirit in the crucible, with the fire underneath, with something going on that maybe you can't even recognize what it is right away. Are you a gentle spirit? Are you somebody that can be talked to? Are you somebody that maybe can turn away a fiery word with a hug, if that's the best way to start it? Comments?
I think one of the big problems I've seen being an elder for a long time is pride. And I think that affects, eldership more than I think anything. Because I've seen men leave this church because of pride.
Yeah.
And it's to me, that's really a stickler.
Yeah. It's these are things. These lists are tough. These are things that, like we've said, aren't just to get there and then you're in.
Yeah.
You got to keep jumping this hurdle daily,
Yeah.
maybe 3 or 4 times a day. Maybe when someone's inviting you over for lunch, their intent is to eat you for lunch. I mean, that happens.
Yeah.
It just is the way of the world. People aren't easy to deal with. But the person who has the responsibility of being our representatives in this, those who stand on the wall protecting us from the dragons outside and the marauders trying to get in, are also having to turn inward and suffer maybe some arrows in the back from the people in it. And how gentle are you about the whole thing? The enemy behind you is sometimes the one we notice more than the ones out front that we should be. The attacks on the church, we expect them to be coming from the outside. We don't necessarily expect them to be coming from the inside, but our reaction should be gentle. It's a tough thing to do, and it's a tough thing to maintain. Probably, this is one of the first ones that gets compromised. It gets a callus built over it, and it doesn't move out of the way as much as it should, and it just pushes back. Prickliness. I'm kind of famous for being prickly. Ask Brandon and Irv. Okay, can we move along, or do you have more questions or comments on that? The next one's a good one. It's being a lover of good. Now, this is in the Titus list. It's not in the Timothy list specifically. And it's something that is maybe there's a reason it's on the one list and not the other, but I think it's a characteristic of what grace looks like in a man's life, involving a willingness to help others at his own detriment frequently, almost maybe all the time, for the sake of the good of the others. It's a sacrificialness, the way it works itself out. All ministry is incarnational. You can't be these things without having to do these things, without having it's not a theoretical thing. Trust me. If you ever served in either of these offices, it's trench warfare. It is hand-to-hand combat. It is tough stuff. It is hard to do. It is incarnational. It will take your whole family with you. And somehow trying to maintain over the fray a sense that your goal is everybody's welfare. The good of the flock is the goal, is what this word speaks to. And I think, therefore, it's a sense in which wherever you are, you're looking for the manifestation of God's grace being shown to to all of us. And you can put tulip in there if you want to. You can put the solas in there if you want to, if you're looking for a system of theology to follow. But it's basically seeing God's intent through the fog of war. That's kind of what's going on here. That's got to have some questions or comments from you guys. No? Well, either I explained it good or I didn't explain it at all. Next one. Being upright. Now there's a challenge. The word means being literally just, righteous, a blameless man who makes fair, just, and upright decisions, a man who's steeped in the standards of Scripture, a man who fears God, turns away from evil. And I put some Scripture examples in there from Job and from 1 John, which if you feel like looking them up, I didn't open my Bible up here, I apologize. But again, the only truly upright man that's ever lived was the God-man. So our example is always going to be Christ, and we're always going to be on a pilgrim's journey to attain this better. But it's, again, something that a man's overall life should be characterized by his being upright. If he's a just or somebody we call, oh, he's a righteous man. He's someone that I can't really find a lot of fault with. Yeah, he's a little rough about the edges here. Maybe he needs to work on this. But, he's somebody that I can trust. He's somebody that I can follow. He's somebody that I can trust to make decisions on my behalf, who has to hear the horror story, who has to sit on the jury and hear and see all the examples of the serial killer stuff, and then come up with a just and a right judgment on my behalf. And that's the kind of guy that we're looking for. That's kind of what uprightness is. Would you trust this person to be a judge, in a sense?
It's an interesting one too. When I was on jury trials, I think that's something that you do. When you're looking at someone a defendant, and you're making a decision about him.
Mm-hmm.
You kind of think about also yourself.
Yeah.
And are you upright?
It's the reason why we were supposed to be able to get a jury of our peers, somebody who is not given to the same criminal behavior that got me in this trial, but somebody who is more reasonable, but sees life from the same perspective, but is maybe somebody whose character judgment is better than mine was. That's kind of the thing that's going on. It's hard to quantify.
I was listening to a trial about a person who was going to be either life imprisonment or death, and then they were interviewing the jury, different people, and they couldn't really come to a definitive answer. And so the one lady that they were interviewing, they decided to pray.
Wow.
And I found that was very interesting.
Wow.
Wouldn't that be lovely?
Yeah.
Probably went over really well in the jury room too, didn't it?
Evidently, everybody wanted to pray.
Wow.
And it was interesting. The decision was that you either have life imprisonment or the execution. And the crime that the kid committed was so bad that they ended up having a conviction notice. So he's on death row. But
wow. It's rough.
But I was impressed that they would do that, because I've been on a number of juries, and that never came up.
Yeah. One thing I want to say on this before we move along is, being upright, or think you're being upright, or something that history will judge you for having been upright, does not necessarily mean it's popular at the time. Okay? So it's also a willingness to stand up, perhaps, and volunteer for some friendly fire to do the right thing. That's what's going on here as well. It's not being a man pleaser. It's somebody who's literally trying to live up to a biblical standard, a principle standard. I can tell already we're going to get maybe through the positives and we're going to do the negatives next week, if that's okay with you guys. All right. So the next one is holy. This is only in the Titus account. And I think we need to be careful of that word. True holiness is something that is not attainable by man. Who was it who started that prayer? Or we used to talk about it a lot in the old days, is pray, Lord, let me be as holy as a man can be. Do you remember that?
No, I don't.
Yeah, it was somebody, but it was a famous prayer. But it's something we should always emulate about ourselves is, Lord, help me be as holy as a man can be. Fill me up with as much holiness as this earthen, finite, fallen vessel can hold without leaking it all out over the ground. And because we're human, it's a bit like trying to carry water in a colander. You better move fast and you better keep filling it up because it's going to leak. But holiness here, in the sense of Titus, speaks of a person, a man being devout. Someone that you are looking at and saying, that man is somebody that in my mind is wholly devoted to God and following his breathed out inscripturated word. If his lamp for his feet, if the light before his eyes is how does God's word come to bear on this issue, and everything that is reasoned for the application at the moment, whether it's, what color carpet we put on the floor, if his mind always goes to, what would God's word have to say about that? That's kind of what we're talking about here now. Maybe that's a lousy example. But it's a guy who is not like he's walking without actually touching the floor, or can literally walk across water that's not frozen. That he's somebody that you can see as someone who is looking to find God's way through this thing. And a willingness to be set apart for God's will. Trust me, any man who's looking at this list and saying, check, 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 I got that, I'm fine here, is never going to pass this test. And the rest of it's not going to be true either. This is, in a sense, for a man, either of these offices, is a volunteering to jump headfirst into a wood chipper. It's not pleasant. It's not easy. It's not fun. But a man will do something like that if he has the kind of a sense that, well, for whether it's in Ephesus or Crete, I guess I'm God's man for the hour. I'm willing to do this because this is something that God says at the beginning of Timothy is a good thing, even though I'm scared to death of it. And you better be, you should be, and you ought to remain that way. It's a sense that the whole package is a man that is willing to approach this with a sense of priority is what God would require in his perfect holiness. Is his being above reproach at the beginning of this list, that transcendent qualification, something that is steeped in possible or copying or emulating or growing into the sense that God's holiness is his transcendent attribute. Is being holy and just in God's eyes the motivation for all the rest of this? Is that a man who would do that? That's what holy means in this context. A man who is dedicated to glorifying God regardless of the opinions of others. Trust me, you will hear the opinions of others. They will not always agree that what you've decided is the right thing to do is the holy thing. Everybody's got an ox that's getting gored. Everyone has their own horse in the race that they want to win. No group of men who are honestly, because this is how fallen the world is. You can have a room full of men who have been determined and are genuinely living up to what this qualification is, still not agree on what's the right thing to do. That's just the nature of the beast. But it's if you can major on the majors and not on the minors, there's hope for the church. Okay? That's what you're looking for here. on the diaconate and in the eldership. Questions on that one? Comments? No? All right. Discipline. This is out of Titus. Maybe it was more of an issue in Crete than in Ephesus.
Sounds like it.
It's similar to being self-controlled, but it's with the addition of looking at habits that have been formed in their lives that support or fight for a continued self-control. That what kind of warfare is going on for discipline? Those of you, I've not been in the military, so maybe I'm the bad example of this. I've not been through a police academy, but I do know from watching it from afar that it seems like discipline is a lot about forced having to tear down your own preconceptions and build up a unit kind of a mentality, a sense in which there's a machinery that is going about the task of whatever it's given to, whether it's warfare in the military, operating a ship in the Navy, being able to have 20 guys show up in 20 different cars to the scene of a crime and have them all know how to react with one another. Discipline is a sense of being personally self-controlled to work in a sense that it cooperates with and it works with the others. If you have, well, a heart is a perfect example of that. You can have every single cell on your heart be a perfect little obedient little cell that when the electrical charge comes, it's going to do its thing. The little muscle is going to contract. But if they're all doing it at a different time, what do we call it? Fibrillation. And people die. And they get shocked into a sinus rhythm. That's kind of what's the similar thing that's talked about here.
I find when I was in the Navy in Vietnam, it was really important. Discipline was so important. I mean, you couldn't operate the ship unless you had your men were disciplined.
Yep.
Yeah, that was very important.
Note too here that disciplined is frequently it's more being trained to be disciplined against things that are destructive behaviors than it is being disciplined for something. Being able to march and step is great. Having muzzle awareness is a discipline too, but it's more of something that you're trained against than it's something you're trained for. And in the sense of a church office, like an eldership or the diaconate, because of the nature of the ministry, being disciplined against things like lust and anger and laziness and bad habits are a very important part of the office. Elders should never meet alone in a room with a woman. Deacons frequently need to go do their job with their wife alongside of it, because the nature of the beast is that fallen men can't be trusted with their hormones. Whether they're elders or deacons or not, that's just one example. But having a system, a discipline in place of how do I deal with this, maybe this problem that I have. Maybe I'm prone to addictive behaviors. What kind of discipline have I put in my life to overcome some of those issues that I have? What disciplines should an elder board have about how it always opens with prayer? It never is allowed to end with anger. You know, there's a million little things you can put in there that are disciplines, that are put up as protections against things, as much as preparation for things. They're habits that you make good habits.
But you know, in the service, and I'm quite sure, and with the police, you have to be disciplined because it's just not you, it's your whole crew.
There's a unit awareness kind of thing.
Unit, absolutely, yeah. Because you either succeed or you fail.
Yep. Two more and then we'll shut down. These ones come from the deacon list in 1 Timothy 3:9, and I think they're really worth looking at. Now, this is going to be because they're having to do with the deacons, and at the beginning of the list in 1 Timothy, Paul just did that whole likewise, the deacons, that kind of grabs everything from the elders list and kind of applies it to the deacons. This is specifically called out for the deacons to do, but it doesn't mean it's not required of elders. This being sound in faith and life. It speaks to the doctrinal beliefs of the deacons specifically, Whereas the elder is going to be somebody who's devoting themselves, as the apostles in Acts 6 were, to the ministry of word and prayer, while the deacons are more given towards the application of body ministry to the physical needs of the church. So this is a sense in which the deacons are being called to having a set of doctrinal beliefs that hold forth the true gospel without wavering, while the thing is being done, while the widow is being ministered to, while the downtrodden is being given some help and some assistance, while some men are over there trying to help take care of a crisis in that household. How does what they believe and all their system of understanding, their holiness and all that other stuff that we've talked about in very general terms, how does it specifically work itself out in the life of a deacon? It is a consistent practice, not just a belief, in how they put their faith and their doctrine to work, literal work in the church. These men maybe have the hardest job in the church. I would say they do. Because an elder can kind of put themselves off to the side, maybe hide in our libraries or little ivory tower kind of thing, and just disperse the deacons to go take care of this. The deacons have to take all of what the church believes, all of what's sound doctrine and the right faith and holiness, and they have to put it to work in some very difficult situations. It's a very high standard. It's also a high calling, but it's something where they perhaps in front of the congregation put their beliefs to work maybe more than the elders do.
One of the biggest things with the deacons that we deal with there is discernment.
Mm-hmm.
To be able to help a person and discern basically whether they're telling the truth about the situation or not.
Yes.
And we've run into a lot of those situations.
And because the deacons are stewards of the whole church's time and treasure applied in that situation, their discernment of what's going on has more immediate, real life effects than does an elder in the counseling setting. An addictive behavior that an elder's dealing with doesn't put a destructive chemical in somebody's arm. It doesn't give them money that they're only going to go gamble away. It speaks in generalities about how a person ought to get their life in order. The deacon puts it to work. They're the tires that are actually on the road as the car of the church is moving down the highway. It's a very difficult thing to do. Okay. Now, I want to point out in here too, it's very easy, and a lot of churches do this, is they just divorce the diaconate from any responsibility of teaching, and that's foolish because they're actually putting teaching to work in a very real life, incarnational way, maybe sometimes more than the other apostles are. The first martyr that we know about in the church was a deacon. Stephen, no sooner was he elevated to deacon than he went out and what did he do? He preached an amazing sermon in the very next chapter of Acts. Philip, one of the seven, was known as the Philip the Evangelist. They're teaching, and they're the ones out there putting what they believe to the point of maybe death. It's a very real teaching responsibility. We may not hand them, here's the keys to the pulpit, get up here and do this. I'm kind of come from a polity that doesn't, have hard lines between these two offices. But don't ever think that a deacon is not somebody that's not a teacher. That's not someone who's preaching with their life about what you ought to be doing. They're the application to every single sermon. Every one. And last, perhaps the one most controversial is this tested thing. And why is it true of deacons but not of elders? Well, are they supposed to come with a set of degrees? Are they supposed to have, Had they, been in a labor union or whatever? I mean, there's all kinds of things that people, foolishness that they put on it. But again, this is a sense in which you're looking at a guy to elevate him to the diaconate who's probably already been doing what a deacon would do. He maybe have been in the trenches, apprenticing, helping, being the first guy that the deacons call for help. It's just now, that's what the testing means. It's like you're looking at his life and seeing, is this somebody that has shown us by everything we can see so far that he's willing, that he's able to be sent out to do it. And by the way, this is also exactly what's been going on in the entire list of qualifications for the eldership. You're testing them with every one of these qualifications. You're making this is the congregation making a determination that this person can be trusted to be put into this office. That's what testing means. Diaconate is more like the stuff. The eldership is more about the ideas, maybe. We should talk about that at some point, because I think there should be more of both. But it's more of a situational judging. It's not like, oh, hey, the Jerusalem Council must approve all candidates for the diaconate. It's not the case at all. It's the congregation
Am I
deciding.
supposed to be serving today?
I mean,
Handing out
probably,
the bulletin?
Well, we're going to stop right here anyway, and we'll just
yes,
do
it is your day.
we'll do another week of the negatives of this. And there'll be overlap with what we've talked about today. But let's go ahead and close in prayer. Bob, would you close for us?
Father God, we give you praise and glory, Lord. We thank you for this time. We thank you for John's lecture. It's so important for us as deacons and elders to understand the requirements that they're set forth by you, Lord. Again, we thank you for John's lecture, Lord. And now we are asking a time, I guess, to go to the sanctuary and listen to Bob. And we just ask that Bob be with us, be with the Lord at this time as he presents his message to us as his congregation. In Jesus' name we pray. Thank you.
Amen.
You ought to have beautiful